All right, welcome back to the lecture. This is lecture number 5. This is the last lecture on the course Theology and History of Mission. And this lecture specifically is an exploration or a reflections on some theological issues in the history of mission, especially from the perspective of Asia. So again, I will be drawing more from my experiences or my learnings on Asia, but it is my hope that you will find these thoughts, these reflections to be helpful, and it is something that you can some points in which you can relate to them. So yes, so the basic structure for this lecture is going to be quite simple today. I have got a few sets of questions, 3 critical questions: whose mission, what goals, and what methods. So I will focus on these 3 questions and share a bit of my reflections on these questions based on some historical insights from some parts of the world. So the critical questions, and then I will look at 1, 2, 3, 4, I think 5 themes that I have. Sorry, I have only 3 themes here, but so I'll look at 3 themes: indigenization, religions, and polycentric faith, especially from the perspective of Asian Christianity and missions in Asia. And then I will give one final story about Christianity, about missions in Northeast India, and then I will revisit these critical questions, and that's pretty much all for the lecture. Okay, so these are that's the outline for today's lecture. I don't have a lot of slides for this today's lecture. A lot of them will have to be listening from your end. So the first question is this: whose mission? Whose mission? Now the answer, of course, you know the answer because we have dealt with this in quite substantial detail in the first 2 or 3 lectures on the theology of mission. But it's a question that's worth asking. And yeah, I mean, think about your own ministries and your own mission in your church or in your organization. Whose mission is it? Whose mission is it? And this is where the question can raise very interesting debates or very interesting reflections. In history, we have also looked at some historical stories from Philippines, from India, and some other parts of the world as well. And in certain parts of the world, through history, mission is understood was not God's mission. Then whose mission was it in the colonial era? Mission was the empire's mission. The empire, whether it's the British Empire or the Belgian Empire or the French or the Spanish Empire, mission was the empire's mission. And that, of course, is a very dangerous paradigm, right? That I think that is the root of many of the problems that colonizations brought to missions. Many of the missionaries, even not all of them, yes, but many of them saw their role as missionaries and their roles as agents of empire as one and the same thing, right? For many of them, they understood their role as missionaries, yes, as allegiance to God, but also their activities. They may not say it openly, but their activities showed that they also were working for the empire. The best example that I mentioned very briefly was in the context of Philippines. The priests who were sent from Spain to lead or to guide the church, the Catholic communities in Philippines, They were, yes, they were first of all priests, but they also functioned as agents of empire. They subdued the peoples. They they enforced Spanish culture. They disallowed vernacular languages to be spoken. So they essentially functioned as agents of empire, right? And that's a tragedy. Like that, that is very much one of the huge problems of colonialism and colonialism's entanglements with mission. I can give you another example. The missionary who first came to Manipur. Manipur is the state where I am from. Some of you may recall this. The first missionary who came to Manipur was a British missionary, and he did a lot of good things. He was an educationist. He brought education. He prioritized on education, prioritized on the vernacular languages. But there's also another lasting legacy that he left in Manipur, which was his role in recruiting soldiers to fight for Britain in the First World War. So he would actively recruit all these tribal Nagas and people in Manipur and send them like as basically as workers for the war. In the First World War, as you may well know, the trademark of the First World War was to dig trenches. Like they would dig trench into the ground where they would hide and shoot enemies. So it's not like open warfare where they run and fight one another. There's a new technique in which they were trench warfare, they call it. And in order to do that, they need enormous amount of labor, workers, to dig the trenches because soldiers were shooting and killing and their role was to fight. On top of that, they need laborers to come and to work to dig the trenches. So many of these tribal Nagas, tribal people from Manipur and from other parts were recruited as labor for the First World War. Now, my point in bringing this story is that William Pettigrew, his name, the missionary who came to Manipur first, was he a missionary? Yes, he was a missionary, but he also acted as agent for the British Empire by actively recruiting people to serve the British Empire in the war. Very shady connection there. Many of the Nagas, many of the tribal people lost their lives. They went and saw the horrors of war. They were in Paris. They were in other parts of France and fighting Britain's war against their enemies. And without any of their consent, without any of their choice, they were sent to fight the war. Again, just an example to show how mission, whose mission? In many cases, especially in colonialism, the mission was the empire's mission to get resources. Many missionaries worked together with the colonial leaders, not in all cases, but in some cases, they worked together with colonial authorities so that the empire can get resources, the empire can get slaves, the empire can get workers, labor, cheap labor, they can get market. Missionaries work together with empire, and in many cases, mission was empire's mission. That's a terrible part of the history that we must recognize and we must acknowledge because we must be careful never to repeat it again because that's mixing politics, mixing nationalism with God's mission, and that is a tragedy. That is a tragedy. So it's an important lesson, a tragic lesson, yes, but an important lesson for us to keep in mind. Mission is never to be understood as empire building. Mission, we can think of empire also in contemporary situations as church empires. Like sometimes churches are so big, and mission is about my church, my denomination, getting as many numbers into my denomination, getting the numbers reflected on the screen, and so that we can look good, we can get more funding. If we're not careful, churches can also replicate and imitate the methods of the empire in the past, of colonial empires, where it's not about helping. Well, it is about helping people, but ultimately the goal is to bring up the name of the church or the denomination. In how is that any different from empire building? Right, it is empire building, and it's hugely problematic. It should be avoided in Christian communities. Let us remember the first question: whose mission? It is God's mission, and it is God's mission alone. It's not my church's mission. It's not my denomination's mission. It's not my country's mission. It's not Naga people's mission. It's not American mission. It's not African mission. It's not Korean mission. It is God's mission. And we as people are simply just joining and giving our input and helping, participating in God's mission. So whose mission? God's mission. Remember that. Not the lessons of colonialism, lessons of empires show us that it is a tragedy. It's an abuse of God's mission to use mission for our own gain. Okay. So whose mission? Let's remember God's mission. Okay, I want to give you 3 minutes to talk about this and just share your thoughts, how you feel, how you think, what do you think about this? Reflect on what I've said. How important, how crucial is this to recognize that this is God's mission? It's not about empire building. It's not about building a business. It belongs to God. It is God's mission. The source is God alone. Okay, so take some time 3 minutes to reflect on this, and we will continue with the next question. All right, so let's continue with the second question. So mission, what are the goals? What are the goals, right? Um, what is the goal, the telos of mission, as we saw in the first or second lecture? What is the goal of mission? I mentioned that the goal of mission is to gather, to bring people to come to God. In lecture 3, I said the goal of mission is reconciliation. God's mission, God's ministry is the ministry of reconciliation, reconciling human beings with God, reconciling human beings with one another, and reconciling creation and the world with God and with one another. God, the goals of mission is to reconcile. The goal of mission is to bring people to God, to gather people, to gather creation to God and the healing and the wholesome peace that only He can give. Shalom, right? Now, the question is this: in the past, in history, or maybe in our own ministries as well, has there been times when there were other goals of mission? Selfish gain, for example, money, to gain money, for example, to gain reputation, for example, or competition. Oh, the Baptist group is doing so well. We need to do much better. Now, this I think there's room for healthy competition, healthy inspiring one another. But when it becomes competitive, when it becomes negatively competitive, that can be a selfish. Um, that can be basically putting a selfish goal in mission. In colonial era, in the colonial era, mission, the goal of mission was expansion, the expansion of the empire, right? We mentioned this in the previous comment as well. It's about the goal of mission is to spread XYZ culture. That is why, and again, um, we need to be compassionate. We need to be gracious. At the same time, we need to point out the mistakes that were done in the name of mission. In the case of Manipur in Northeast India, the missionaries thought that the way to go as Christians was to become Western, to let go of cultures like Rongmei, the Naga culture, the tribal culture, traditions, none of that. They should become basically like them, dress like them, become educated like them, read like them. So yeah, so the goal was to spread some kind of civilizing. They also, this move is also called the civilizing mission, right? I've read similar trends like that in Africa as well. The civilizing mission was the goal was to civilize people, to bring the natives, to bring the barbarians to the same level as the Western societies. That is, in my opinion, nonsense. I mean, it's not true at all, and we are still reeling from the after effects of those goals of intentions of mission, which was to quote unquote civilize the natives. Those, of course, are heavily influenced by, if we can call it, racist and uh, supremacist views about societies, about peoples, and of course we don't have to go into details of that. But I think what we see is missing in those missions is that they don't realize that the mission of God is to reconcile people, not to oppress them, not to think, oh, they are in such a big mess, we have to pick them up and we have to help them. They do it with a good heart, but ultimately the outcome is that uh, they they cut people from their traditions, they cut people from their families and their land, right? So the empire building, in fact, you may be aware that one of the most important slogan of the British Empire was "For God and for country." In other words, the goal of mission was to promote, to expand, and to grow the empire, the British Empire. That, of course, is hugely problematic, right? So, what goals? We need to remember that the goals of mission is to reconcile, to bring people to the healing and transformative power of God in Jesus Christ, to reconcile the creation to God, to bring them to a place of peace and wholeness and shalom. Another example that I want to give you is comes from Canada. Canada, of course, is in North America. Um, the the missionaries, many of them, in this case, this would be the Catholic missionaries, would work together with the empire, the British Empire, the French, They would work together to they would work together um, to basically influence and guide the indigenous peoples of Canada, who are also called First Nations people, to away from their culture and away from the tradition. So many of these practices involved taking the children, the indigenous children, out of their homes, their families, and putting them in places called reservation, their schools, residential schools, and reservation areas where they would not be allowed to speak in their language. They have to speak in English or French or whatever it is, and they would be forced, with Christian teachings and missionary teachings. And the impulse or the intention of that practice was to give them progress, to civilize them. But the negative, the problem with that is that they assume that the native or the traditional practices or traditional culture is uncivilized, is barbaric, and it's not worth practicing, right? These are paternalistic attitudes. These are unhealthy attitudes that Western societies had towards non-Western cultures, like the First Nations cultures. The same thing happened in Africa as well. The same thing happened among us in the tribal communities in Northeast India and everywhere else. Like they thought that Western culture is the highest, most pristine heights of human civilization, and they wanted everybody else to get there. Some people might say that's a good intention. I don't think it's a good intention. Whatever it is, the goal of mission, according to them, was not reconciliation in that sense. The goal of mission was to paternalistically pull them to progress, to pull them to what they understood as civilization. And that, of course, backfired massively, and that has become a huge scar in the history of places like Canada, or missionary activities around the world, in Africa, in Asia, and elsewhere, right? So, what goals? We need to remember the goals of mission is reconciliation, reconciling people and creation to God, and reconciling the world in Christ. Not to cut people, not to hurt and harm people, not to abuse people, not to paternalistically and extract your benefits from other people. That is not the way Christ is. That is not the way God is. I can even say that if people are hurt, if societies are being abused, human beings, if environments are being abused in the name of mission, that goes exactly in contradiction to who God is. God is the God of healing. God is the God of reconciliation. God is the God of 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 um, of peace. And of course, the Hebrew word peace, shalom, is I've used this a number of times. Shalom is more than just the lack of fighting. Shalom is wholeness of yeah of a peace that is whole and complete and harmony, right? So that is the goal of mission. And maybe in our contemporary situation, you might ask this question: what is the goal of mission in my context? Is it for wealth? Is it for influence? Is it to compete with the fellow churches in our city? Is it for prestige? Is it to look good? Is it to create a reputation of power and influence? Uh, is it running like a business with the intention of growing the wealth? Um, all of this can be used positively, but in most cases, as we have seen in the world, when churches grow into this massive, like an industry, it can be problematic. It can be hugely problematic, as we have seen in many cases where churches are found to be corrupted. Our churches are evading uh, their responsibilities of helping people, right? So we can say a lot of things, but my point here is we need to remember the goals of mission is reconciliation and healing and harmony, not pain and hurt and violence. I'll give you another 2-3 minutes to reflect on this, and maybe reflect personally on your church context and in your ministry context, and just take some time to share and think how important this aspect is in for you and for your ministry. All right, so let's look at the third question then. What methods? Mission, what methods? How are we supposed to go about doing our mission? Of course, the answer here, the right answer would be the methods that we use should be reliant on God, to rely on God's power, to rely on God's spirit. To use again the metaphor that I used earlier, which was the metaphor of a train. If you get on a running train, and if you imagine the train as a symbolic of God who is already moving in this earth, who is already actively doing his mission from beginning of time, remember, it's not us who initiates. From, if we imagine God as doing his thing, the work of mission, already in action, then we need to rely on the what God is already doing instead of relying on our own, relying completely on our own techniques and our own strengths and power, right? We need to listen to God. We need to listen to what God is doing in this world. Uh, we need to follow God, right? If God is going ahead of us, and if the Spirit is going ahead of us and doing His work and mission, we need to be attentive to what He is doing, instead of insisting that we should go this way, we should go that way, we should do it this way. Instead of forcing our own methods, we should listen to what God is doing. First of all, that means the notion, I want to bring in the notion of cultural superiority. I think in missions, it's very easy to fall into the trap of cultural superiority, to get a sense that I'm the teacher, you listen to me, you all listen to me, we are the church, we are the Christian population, we know what is best. I think I've made myself clear. It is my belief that God, I've told you about how the missionaries in Northeast India, they wanted to reach the civilized people, the people in the plains in Manipur, in Assam, in India, in Myanmar. But instead of finding success there, they found success among the tribal people. And now the tribal people have accepted Christ, and they are one of the most Christianized areas in the world. Of course, that also comes with a lot of problem. But my point here is that you should not assume that you know how God is going to work. We should not assume that we know better than God. God's ways are mysterious, and God works in different ways. So cultural superiority is saying, okay, we have the gospel, we have the Bible, we have the books, we have the techniques, we will tell you what to do. And you all listen to us. You all listen to us. You all are babies, you all listen to us. That cultural superiority should not be present at all. I've said this earlier as well. The theology of the death of the church, the demise of the church, teaches us to be humble, to listen to one another. So the method of mission is to be attentive to what God is doing. To be attentive to what God is doing. If God is going ahead of us and we are following Him, then we must listen closely and we must observe what God is doing. What that means is that we need to listen to people. I need to listen to you. You need to listen to your friends, people around you. What is God doing in your church, in your community today? What is God doing in Africa? What is God doing in China? What is God doing in Korea? Right? What is God doing in the Philippines? What is God doing in the UK? What is God doing among African church in the UK? What is God doing among the Chinese church in the UK? What is God doing among, you can fill in the blanks, right? And we need to listen to what God is doing. That is the method. The method is to be attentive and listen to God, what God is doing in this world today. And when you hear or sense that this is what God is doing, we need to follow Him. We need to listen to Him and go along and humble ourselves and do what we need to do. The method of mission is not human techniques. It's not human wisdom. Although all these things also come to play, I don't want to minimize that. I don't mean to say that we should just forget everything and just do some meditation. No, I don't mean it that. I don't mean in that way. I think we should rely on wisdom. I think we should rely on people. We should rely on studies. I'm also doing a PhD right now. We should rely on books. We should rely on scholars. We should rely on pastors, people practicing. We should even listen to people who don't believe in Jesus. What are people saying about about Christ, about God, about the world, right? We should be listening to uh, the most unlikely of places, because mission is what God is doing, and you cannot put God in a box and say, God, you can only function out of my Naga church here. What we do is what God you should be doing. You cannot force God into a box like that. God, the Bible says, Jesus said to Nicodemus, the wind blows where it pleases. God works wherever he pleases. Our role is not to force him to do what we want. Our role is to check out and find what he is doing in this world and go and follow him in what he's doing, right? Um, so I like one thing that I enjoyed learning about in the past few years was about surfing where you get into the sea and you play around in the waves, right? What I discovered, I don't know how to surf, by the way. I just learned it as from other people and from documentaries. What I learned from people who surf is that apparently you need to listen to the wind. You cannot surf in your own will. You have to listen to the wind. You have to look at the wave, and then you have to surf according to what is going on with the wind and the waves. You cannot form your own wave, right? You cannot form your own wind. You have to listen. You have to be attentive to what the wind and the wave is doing. And when all those things come together, you get a nice surf. You get a beautiful and adventurous, fun surf. I find that very similar to missions as well. We need to be listening to what God is doing. So the method of mission is to listen to God, to be attentive to what God is doing in this world, rather than to rely on your own, uh, force your own will, or force your own sense of superiority in any of the activities. Okay. So what methods? The method is, of course, that involves prayer, praying, and listening to God. It involves reading the Bible and soaking yourself in the Word of God so that you understand to the best of your ability. You understand who God is, what God is doing, what is the will of God in this world, and talking with people, expanding your horizon. Don't talk to only people in the church. Talk to people outside of the church. Talk to friends outside. Maybe have friends who are from different denomination. You have no idea how much you can learn if we are able to talk with people from outside of your denomination, or talk to people who don't believe in God. Read a book that you normally would not read. Listen to scholars who are studying Christianity in Iraq, history of Christianity in Iraq, and observe, study, reflect, think about all of these things. These are the ways in which we can be listening to God. And through this method, we can, hopefully by God's grace, be more in tune with what He is doing in this world. Okay. All right. So I'm going to give you 10 minutes now, and I have a small task for you that I would like to ask you to do. So speaking of which, sorry, I didn't give any specific examples for the third question. What methods? I think the best example I can give you for this third issue, the issue of method, is the issue in our from our Naga tribal context. The missionaries came to the Nagas, and they just impose what they think is the best. No more songs, traditional songs, no more traditional dresses. You do this. This is the best way. This is our way. This American clothing, American books, American Bible. Of course, they gave us the vernacular Bible, but they imposed even the ways of reading Bible, the ways of doing sermons, the ways of singing with piano and choir and all of that, which we're grateful. But the my point here is that they thought that they knew what is best. They thought that the method that they had was the best, and they imposed that on the indigenous converts. The interesting thing that happened was in the 1950s, 1970s, there was a massive revival, and the revival was the impetus for the growth in Christianity. And what's interesting in the revivals was that the methods of Christianity, Christian faith, was completely upset. Like Indigenous types of singing were were found to be more effective. Indigenous dancing were found to be more effective. So when the missionaries came, they thought that they can impose this their style of doing Christianity, their style of mission, and they did that and they left. But the indigenous Christians slowly, with through the revivals, they find out that no, that's not necessarily the only way, the only method. Here is also a way of doing things, and the indigenous dancing, indigenous singing, those methods turned out to be more effective, much more effective, and so the evidence in a way is shown in the high percentage of Christianity that we see in the Naga community. So that's an example of how we cannot have cultural superiority, or we cannot impose a certain method of doing things in mission. So yes, so whose mission is it? It's God's mission. What's the goal of the mission? It's reconciliation. And what methods? The method is to be attentive to God and to be attentive to the people as they try to articulate their faith in God. So okay, I want to give you a task, 10 minutes task, and I want you all to ask one another this question. How do we ensure that our mission activities are protected by the right perspective on whose mission, and what methods? What are the goals and what are the methods? How can we ensure that our mission activities are protected from from the abuses that we have just talked about in colonialism and so on and so forth? How do we ensure that our mission activities are protected by having the right mission, the right goal, and the right methods? Does that make sense? How do we ensure that our mission activities are protected by having the right mission, the right goals, and the right methods? Can you think of some practical pointers? I'll give you 10 minutes, and I want you to, if you are slightly confused about the question, that's okay. I want you to talk with your friends, talk with your colleagues there, and just reflect together, and think for your own context, like how can we ensure that we don't do the mistakes of the past, and we ensure that we have the right mission, the right goals, and the right methods. 10 minutes. Also, just to quickly add, after the 10 minutes is up, you can take a break, because that I think we're approaching the 1 hour mark as well. So we'll take a 3 minutes break, and then we'll continue right into the second hour of the lecture. Well, the second half of the lecture. All right. Okay, well, let us continue with our lecture, the last section of our lecture, the second half of our lecture. I want to deal with some theological issues on mission. I'm calling this section Agency and Originality, Christianity as an Indigenous Religion. So my idea here in this section is to argue that Christianity has the capacity to be translated and to be indigenized as into the context that we live in. Okay, so in your case, it'll be in Africa. That we Christian converts, Christian indigenous converts, indigenous Christians, we have the agency and we have the power to be original as we think about Christianity, as we incorporate Christianity into our context, into our specific experiences. So that is the main theme that I want to look at. And within this, I've got three large parts. First is indigenization. The second is religions, and the third is polycentric faith. By religions, I mean the reality of the plurality, the pluralism that we live in this world. It's very likely that you live in a situation, in a context, in a society where there are not just Christians, but there are people from different religions. In the case of India, and anyway, I'll get into that. I should refrain from giving too much details at this point, but I just want to say I'm talking about the plurality, the fact that we live in a diverse, a religiously diverse environment today. So indigenization, religions, and polycentric faith. The picture that I've put here in the background is the portrait of a man named Raja Ram Mohan Roy, and he's a reformer, a social reformer, a leader, religious leader in India, who was around at the same time with William Carey and the missionaries in I showed you in East India, in Calcutta. And he wrote, Raja Ram Mohan Roy was a very interesting figure. He really liked the idea, the teachings of Jesus. And he wrote this book called The Precepts of Jesus, the Guide to Peace and Happiness. What's interesting about this book is that in this book, Raja Ram Mohan Roy argues that Jesus can be understood in terms of Indian culture and Indian how should I put it? Indian thought forms, right? Indian context. The big argument, the big point of his argument is that Jesus is, first of all, an Asian. And Asian people, Indian people, Asian people have, according in his argument, have the ability to understand Jesus much better than European context, because Jesus was an Asian. Jesus was in what we call today Middle East or ancient Near East. So it's closer culturally to India, and so because of that, Raja Ram Mohan Roy argues that Jesus can be understood quite accurately, and in his argument more accurately than from a European context. And even though Raja Ram Mohan Roy is not a Christian, and he does not come to the same conclusions that we Christians would agree with, at the same time, his arguments were very influential, and in a way he started, well, he didn't start, but he's representative of a trend in India in which scholars or intellectual leaders try to understand Jesus in their own terms. And I know that the same kind of trend is also present in Africa. One of my lecturers in my master's, Diane Stinton, she did her doctorate, her studies on Jesus and the way Jesus is understood in Africa. And the book that she published out of that research was called Jesus of Africa. It's a really interesting book that I really enjoyed. And in that book, she shows that many African theologians, many church leaders have tried to grapple with who Jesus is from the African context. and it's such a refreshing kind of work that people are doing, theologians are doing in Africa. So that the whole approach, the whole exercise that I'm talking about here is connected to the notion of indigenization, the first point that I've written here. To indigenize or to contextualize Jesus or Christianity in the context of the specific place like Africa or India. So that's Raja Ram Mohan Roy, and the reason why I'm putting here as the background is to put him as representing that trend, the trend of seeing Christianity as an Asian indigenous religion, in the same way, I guess, for Africa as well. Okay, so let's go into the next slide. Okay, indigenization. Let's look first at indigenization, and I've put here Christianity as an Asian religion, but you can put that. I'm going to talk mainly from Asian perspective, but you can think of that in any other context as well. Very quickly, I want to go through some of these points. The first picture in this slide, the three self principle of Chinese Christianity. When Christianity was growing in China, and especially this was during the later half of the 20th century, 1950s onward. You remember from historical context the history that China was a communist state at the time, and they had removed all of the Western missionaries. But what happened from that historical moment was that this three self, they call it the three self. This was a principle that was promoted by Christians, by Chinese indigenous Christians, and they said that the three self principle says that Christianity in China must be self-propagating. Self-propagating means self-propagating, to employ indigenous Chinese evangelists to propagate the gospel. So, in other words, to not rely on Western missionaries, but to rely on native Chinese missionaries, right? Self-propagating. Secondly, self-supporting, that they should not rely on funding from outside, from other sources, but they should be self-supporting. They should generate whatever resources they need, that they can then support and sustain their own ministry. And self-governing. In other words, they are not to be led by some foreign agency or by other foreigners who are church leaders, but it should be governed, and the authority should be in the hands of the natives, the Chinese. That's a powerful historical moment in the history of China. The three self principle became very influential, became an important part. Sure, there are some controversial issues with that, but I think the basic notion is that the Chinese indigenous Christians, that converts, felt it was important to assert the three self for Christianity. And I wonder if this makes sense, or this may be of interest for you as well, as you think about missions. Like, should we only depend on external people to help us propagate? Like, in other words, should we only rely on Western missionaries or foreign missionaries to support us? Yes, there's a time for that, but the example of Chinese Christianity shows us that it's important to also maintain, and to also like go for self-support, to be self-propagate, to rely on yourself, to not rely on others, but to be able to be independent and stand for your own self, right? So self-propagating, self-supporting, this is a challenge for many of us in the majority world, or as they call developing nations, to be self-supporting. Almost all the time we need external funding, people to support us, people to give us the resource that we need. But again, the example of Chinese Christianity is that they decided that they will be self-supporting. Whatever support we need, whatever resource we need, we will support ourselves, we will generate ourselves. I think that's a great example of something that we all need to learn as well. Self-governing, we should decide, or we should govern our own systems and our own churches, right? I think this is quite self-explanatory. leadership should be held by the indigenous converts, the indigenous Christians. So yeah, I think this is a great paradigm for three self principles of Chinese Christianity that we can also learn and we can also reflect in our own context. As far as Chinese Christianity is concerned, we have seen that the three self principles have been quite influential. And today, if anything, the success, or I don't like the word success, the fact that Christianity is growing in China is, I think, a testimony to the partially the success of this three self principle of Chinese Christianity: self-propagating, self-supporting, and self-governing. Please take note of this. I will ask you to discuss this with your colleagues later. The second picture that I've put here, Sadhu Sundar Singh. He's an Indian Christian who converted from Hinduism. What's interesting about him is that when he became a Christian, he had the option to become westernized in his religion, in his Christianity, but he chose to remain and dress like his previous life. He chose to remain in the culture of his people, and he even adopted the term sadhu. Sadhu means a holy man or a teacher, and he continued to retain the title, the Hindu title, the Hindi title rather, of a teacher or holy man. Sadhu Sundar Singh is a very important figure in Indian Christianity today, and he represents the strand of Christians who remain within the culture of Indian society and remain faithfully a Christian, without the need to become westernized, or without the need to be adopted into a Western church like Anglican Church or Baptist Church, and yet he remained very much an Indian. If I'm not mistaken, he even says that he's a Hindu. He remains a Hindu Christian, and of course that can sound problematic. But what he means is that he remains culturally Indian. Culturally he remains an Indian, even though he becomes a Christian. The third picture that I've put here, just for a brief reflection, the Naga indigenous evangelists. I've mentioned this very briefly previously, that in Naga society, it was not so much the missionaries who were the most influential, but it was the indigenous evangelists, the people, their own children, their own young men and women who became Christians and who played very, very active roles in propagating the gospel among their fellow communities. Not just within their communities, many of these indigenous evangelists had very important roles to play in spreading the gospel to neighboring tribes. Okay, so for example, my community, Rongmei Nagas, we were historically enemies with, well, enemies is not the best word here, but the Rongmei Nagas as a tribe usually had tensions with another group called the Kukis. But the remarkable and beautiful thing that happened with Christianity is that it was a Kuki Christian evangelist who was one of the first evangelists to the Rongmei Nagas, and he lived with the Rongmeis, and many Kukis since then came and lived with the Rongmei Nagas, and they taught the gospel to us. They taught us how to sing like them. So it turned out to be a very influential, and the Kukis turned out to be very influential in their Christianity to the Rongmei Nagas. So that's also another example of how indigenous evangelists played such an important role in Northeast India. So so that's something about the notion of indigenization, such an important theme, and I think it can sound like a very very tricky idea, but I think it's something that we should engage with in our local context. How are we indigenizing the Christian religion? I think I mentioned this previously. Lamin Sana, who is an African missiologist or theologian, he talked about the translatability, the translation of the gospel in different contexts. And he says that is the beauty and the power of the gospel, that it can be translated in different contexts. And I think that that is very closely related to the notion of indigenizing. That when the gospel comes to a particular context and it's translated into a particular context, it becomes indigenized. It becomes part of the culture that it is incorporated in. I will talk more about this later, so let me move on to the next one. The second one that I've mentioned here is religions, or it has to do with religions. As I mentioned, my point here is that in Asia, we cannot get away from the fact that there are many, many religions in Asia. You cannot simply just live in a Christian place and isolate yourself among Christian communities. In Asia, you live with different religions. And this, of course, has to do with sort of a corrective. Well, let me simplify what I mean by that. In the West, in America, in UK, not so much now, but 30, 40 years back, it was assumed that Western society is a Christian society. And so theologies and missions and all of that were made out of that context of living in a Christian society. That is absolutely not true in Asia. In Asia, you live with Muslims, you live with Hindus, you live with traditional religions, and all of these religions that are listed here. For example, you look at India. Of course, this map is a very generalized map, so it doesn't convey the reality at all. For example, you see here Bangladesh out in this. If you can see the red mark here, I hope you can see. Hang on, let me. So if you can see here, this part here should be green because that's Bangladesh, and that is a Muslim predominantly Muslim state. And then we've got a part here should be Buddhist, and lot substantial green here because there's Islam, and substantial green down here because there's Islam, and there's also should be red here because there's Christians as well. A lot of, and as I mentioned, Christians here as well. So yeah, this is a very general map, but at least it gives an idea of the kind of complexity that is in Asia. You can see from this map so we've got Christians. Even within Christianity, there's Roman Catholic, there's Protestant, and there's Eastern Orthodox. Then even within Islam, there's as you can see here, there's Sunni and the Shia, and then we've got Hinduism. Seems to be mostly in India, but also to be found in Indonesia, some part of Indonesia here. There's Judaism. Judaism are scattered most here, and some communities here in India as well. Then there's Buddhism in Southeast Asia and Sri Lanka. So yeah, you can tell that this map is all over the place. It's very hard, of course, to get a very accurate map like this, when especially on such a big scale. But what I'm trying to say is that Asia is a very complex religious landscape, and when you talk about missions in Asia, you have to think about these religions, the reality of many religions. So there are also traditional and tribal religions as well, as we see here in this section. There are tribal Christians and Muslims. It seems to be pointing towards Africa, which is interesting. It should be also in Northeast India, but yeah, okay, anyway. So the reality of religions in today's world, that is simply something that we need to take into account when we think of missions in Asia or in Africa, for that matter. I understand. I know that in Africa, especially as reflected in this map, the top part is predominantly Muslim population. We've got Christians in the south, but there's also tribal, traditional religions. And so, yeah, I understand that it's a very complex landscape in Africa as well. And it's just something that we have to live with, and we have to factor in as we think about missions and Christianity and all of that. So it's not a lot of things to say, although we can say a lot. We can There can be many things that we can bring out here, but I just want to point out the complexity of the culture and the complexity of human of religions and different plural cultures in Asia and in Africa. Um, right. So let's move on. Let's move on. Um, I didn't include here, but some of the another theme that I can talk about here is the role of education, the role of education, the role of quote unquote development and medicine in the history of mission. We I From my own context in Rongmei Nagas in Northeast India, the one of the most important aspect of missionary work in my part of the world is its connection to education. And I learned from the book that I'm reading, I shared to you some time back as well, was that when Christianity came to, I think it was in Uganda. um, I'm trying to find it here. In Uganda, the Christians were called the book people, and I thought that was really interesting because of their active role in providing education for the converts. To become Christian means to be educated or to focus on education, and I definitely echo that understanding in my own context. For example, here in the book, it says in parts of Africa, the word for reading was the same as the word for Christian. I thought that was really interesting. That to be a Christian means to be reading, to be educated, and of course, part of that was that Christianity also taught the superiority of Western civilization, which of course comes back to the same issue that we talked in the previous lecture about the goal of mission. The goal of mission in colonial era was understood as a method of civilizing the natives, civilizing the barbarians, which of course we don't agree at all. But part of that was education, and education became a big mechanism or um, big partner of mission activities in Asia as well, and as I understand, even for Africa too. So so that's education. Also, we need to think about development. Again, I learned from this book that in parts of Africa, the missionaries would use technology to show the Africans the power of Western civilization, the power of being Christians, which they understood as equal to being Western. So they would use electricity to say to refute traditional religions and say that uh, um, the god, the deities of light is not um, are not those small small spirits, right? So I'm sorry, let me try and find that, and then I can talk to you more intelligently. So according to the ancestral religions, they believe that a particular god or particular deity is a god of light, for example. And apparently missionaries would use electricity and technology to show them that those gods or those deities are not the god of light, not the god of power. So development was also a big part of the appeal for missions and Christianity. Medicine, of course, do not necessarily need to say a lot here in this regard. Medicine, the many of the missionaries were also doctors, and they promoted medicine, Western medicine, um, and used medicine as a way of refuting the power of their gods and their rituals. So medicine was also an important partner in mission activities. So education, development, medicine, and missions were almost always entangled together. We need to think, how can we think about that theologically? Um, I think we can appreciate that medicine and development and education are all good things, and that has helped our societies. In my own case as well, but at the same time, I think the the mixing of Western civilization and Western culture as the way to go has been slightly problematic, and I think in recent years, of course, that has been criticized, and yeah. So I think, but we need to recognize that mission came together with education and development and medicine, and yes, we definitely recognize that aspect. Okay, so let's keep going. Let's keep going. The other theme, theological theme that I want to focus on is the polycentric faith. Polycentric means there's not only one center. There's many centers of Christian faith. There's in the past it used to be called the from the west to the rest. Means like west. The west is the center, and it is from the west. Theological education goes to Africa, to Asia. From the west, the churches are expanded and they're sent as missionaries to the west, from to Asia, to Africa, to different parts of the world. From the west, money for institutions are sent to different parts of the world. So there's one center in the west. Back in the understanding was back in the days that there's one center in the west, and everybody has to go to the center in order to get resources, in order to get theological ideas, in order to get uh, to in order to get its source right. Of course, that has been refuted these days. These days, the truth is that we have found out that Christianity is not a one-centered faith. It's not the West that is the center. It is a polycentric faith. There are many centers around the world. In fact, the center, the idea of center itself is not very helpful, is it? But I think just for the metaphor here, it's helpful to remember that Christianity is not based in one place where everything else must look to and everything else must find its inspiration from one place. I think the notion used to be like that in the past when there was uh, an empire. In an empire or even in a country, we have one capital, and the seat of the government of that country is usually in the capital. And from the capital, we call it the center. The center sends money, the center sends resources. The center is the sphere, the center of influence. From that center, everything else is we derived, right? So that used to be the understanding about Christianity as well. But in recent decades, or maybe in the past 100 years, that has been completely refuted thanks to scholars like Lamin Sana, as I've mentioned repeatedly, and Andrew Walls that I mentioned in the first few lectures. They have pointed out that Christianity is not a one-centered place in the West. It's a polycentric faith. One of the best examples of this polycentric faith is, of course, the 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 landscape of missions. You see here, this is a picture from a missions meeting. Um, if you look closely, we see uh, we've got all uh, people from Africa. Uh, yes, there are. This is a picture from a Korean agency, so there's also some Koreans in the group, and that itself speaks about the beauty of the interconnected world that we live in, right? Uh, the center of Christianity is not in London or in US. Today it is in Africa, in Nairobi, in your hometowns, in Uganda, in India, in Korea, right? In UK, yes. And we all have this part to play. We all have our specific roles to play in this polycentric dynamic that is Christianity today. Mission is not from one place to the other any longer. Mission today is from everywhere to everywhere, right? Not from the west to the rest like before. Mission is everywhere to everywhere. Mind you, not just the church, by the way, not just in the church. Mission is not just from the church to the outside any longer. Mission is from everywhere to everywhere. Maybe in your offices or in your working, in the industry, wherever it is, right? Mission is from everywhere to everywhere. As I mentioned in the previous lecture, the walls have been broken. God's mission has been poured out as it should be, has been poured out and set loose into the world. This is God's mission that we are involving in. And just like God has been doing from the past, we are continuing the work of mission in the world, not just in the church, not just in the West, not just in Africa, not just in Korea, not just in the center, but in this polycentric reality that we live in today. So we think of mission activities. Mission activities reflect that polycentric reality. We think of indigenous evangelism, just like I told you about India. Indigenous evangelists who have played such significant role in the propagation of the gospel. We think about China, where self-supporting, self-propagating, they send out their own missionaries. We think about all of that, and we realize that yes, the world is Christianity in the world today is polycentric. It's not from one place to the rest, but it is really everyone participating in mission. I might just add also the fact that we are having this program today is because a Korean university in Torch Trinity in Korea, in partnership with a Korean mission, connected with African seminaries in Africa from different countries in Africa, and reached out to international students like me, who is based in UK but is living in from India, living in UK, and I have this chance to connect with you in this very wildly networked kind of connections. But we are all together here, reflecting together on this reality. This itself, this moment itself, when I'm talking and when you're listening, when we are discussing, this itself is an example or testament of the polycentric reality that we live in. So, my brothers and sisters, I want to encourage you. There is no one center that we must appeal to any longer. You and I, we all have the calling. You and I, we all have the roles that we can play in order to participate together in God's mission. So let's be encouraged and let's do what we can do. Let's expand our vision of mission. Let's not think only of the limited things that we can do, but let's expand our vision and let's serve and in the mission of God, the Missio Dei, the mission of God that has been opened for us. So the question is remains for us as we think about this. Let's go back to this polycentric faith. The question is this: if faith and mission is polycentric today, from everywhere to everywhere, who should we listen to? So I come back to the question that I asked you. If you have a program or if you have a question, what books do you recommend? What kind of speakers? Let's say you have a huge program and you want to invite somebody to speak. Who will you invite? Are we still going to invite the same kinds of people? Don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that you should not invite. Please try to understand what I'm trying to say. Are we going to keep imposing the same kind of dynamic, the same kind of channel from the West to the rest, from the West to the rest? Or are we going to expand our vision? Are you going to start listening to our brothers and sisters from China? Am I going to start listening to you, my brothers and sisters from Africa? Who are we going to listen to? Who gets the focus? That's the critical question that we need to address. And that's the important question for us. Who are you listening to today? Is your mission, is your faith still reliant on the old connections of the West to the rest? Or is your faith, is your mission, is your activities reliant and energized by the polycentric realities of our faith today? One of my favorite things in the studies that I'm doing, my PhD that I'm doing, one of my favorite things to do is to learn from people I've never heard. People from Mongolia. What God is doing in Mongolia. What God is doing in Ghana. All right? What God is doing in Myanmar. And what God is doing in the Philippines. I love hearing these stories because it shows us the reality that God is doing something that's polycentric. And unless we also listen to that, and unless we also start acting according to those realities, we are going to miss out. We're going to be hearing only one. Think of it as a choir. A choir has different parts, and not just choir. Let's say orchestra. It's got an orchestra as well. There's different instruments. There's like X, Y, and Z kind of instruments. There's the choir, and we have all this complex music of God's mission in this world. But I want to listen to only what shall we say, the tenor, only the tenor. The tenor is great, but how about we listen to the whole spectrum of what God is doing? How amazing would that be, right? So I want to encourage you with this focus emphasis on polycentric faith. Let's start listening to one another. Let's start listening to one another. Let's start paying attention to what God is doing around the world. Let's stop being fixated on just one part of the world. You know what part of the world I'm talking about. And let's start focusing on what God is doing everywhere, from everywhere to everywhere. Okay. All right. So that I think I've come to the close of the theological reflections. I want to ask you to spend some time and just reflect with your colleagues. I want to give you 5 minutes. Yeah, I think 5 minutes is fair. I want to give you 5 minutes, and I want you to talk about your thoughts on the things that we have just gone through, and think about indigenization, think about religions, and in the reality of the polycentric faith that we live in. And yeah, I want you to discuss and encourage one another, motivate one another, and think of ways that you can implement this in your ministry and in your mission. And I'll give you 5 minutes to talk about that. Okay. So let's do that. And then I will tell you one more story from the context of Northeast India. And then that's it for my lecture. All right. Have a good time in discussing. All right, so let's wrap this up. I want to tell you one story, a cautionary tale um, about what happened in our context, in my context, um, and let this story. It's a bit of a yeah, it's a cautionary tale, so it's a bit tragic. But uh, my hope in sharing this story is for us to think, reflect deeply. Um, I want to share from my context, but I want to invite you to think, reflect deeply about your own context, and think about mission, and think about what we can do as God's people participating in God's mission in this world. So a few pictures here that I've put here. As you can see, the picture, the forest is quite dense. These are a typical forest that we have in our back in our place. I imagine some of you may also find this familiar. These are the forests that our people have lived from time immemorial, from long time in history, hundreds of years. And these are some of our cultural artifacts, some of our cultural wear, traditional dresses. We have a um, rich history, rich culture, rich tradition um, that involves, yes, warfare, that involves dances, that involves, it's mainly agricultural. And as you can see here in this picture here in the shawl, this is a depiction of the understanding of cosmology. Cosmology is a big word. By that I mean cosmology means the way the world is structured. Okay, so human beings live together in harmony, at least in theory, in harmony with nature. Human beings live in in close relationship with nature, with trees, with animals. Their even their dresses, their look at this necklace here. The adornments are made from animals and from plants, from natural artifacts. So yeah, human beings lived very closely with nature. When Christianity came, and this is what my opinion is, when Christianity came, the Christian teaching taught them that human beings are special, and human beings are God's creation, and that's true. That is what the Bible teaches us. But part of the outcome of that, what happened was that they started thinking that nature is not important any longer. Nature is um, nature is something that human beings can use for their own gain. They can exploit for their own gain, right? So human beings do not need to regard nature, respect any longer. You can do whatever you want. If you want to cut down the trees for timber, you can do that. If you want to extract the stones for your house, you can do that. If you want to use the soil for your construction, you can do that. If you want to put roads there, you can do that. You can do whatever you want. So, as the image shows here, in previous traditional life, I'm not saying that it was perfect. It was not perfect. There were so many issues. There was injustice. There was fear, and there was uh, curses that people put on one another. And so it was kind of a terrible. In some ways, it's not the ideal way to live. But one of the outcome was that the kind of harmonious relationship with nature was broken because of the irresponsible exploitation of nature. And could not Christianity could not fight this exploitation, because the problem was that mission was thought to be only about evangelism. Mission was thought to be only about helping the souls, uh, working for the souls and salvation of the souls. Instead of thinking in a bigger picture, mission was perceived to be only about souls and about ministry. So the five paradigms that I shared earlier, right? The evangelism, formation, compassion, justice, creation care. Only evangelism and maybe a bit of formation was considered as part of mission. So all this creation care, all this justice, all this compassion, these were considered social work or social justice. So people did not pay attention. And because of that, there was a huge exploitation of nature. And I think I mentioned the story a few days back, was it last week? incessant rain, and the lack of trees, deforestation, the loose soil because of all the irresponsible digging and excavating led to a massive landslide, led to massive ecosystem problems in the ecosystem. The reason why I'm sharing this story is that with Christianity, Christianity came as a foreign faith. Foreign because it was not designed, or it was not indigenized properly into the context of the Rongmen Naga people. You know what I mean? I hope you understand what I'm trying to say here. Christianity was not indigenized properly. It was not contextualized properly in the context of the Rongmen Naga. Instead of that, the idea was to progress, to become a Christian means to be like the Westerners. So let's build house like them. Let's make concrete houses. Let's build our roads like them. Let's live our cultures like them. And they completely disregarded their own traditional cultures, their own traditional indigenous ways of life that protected the land, that protected the forest. Instead of that, they started looking only to US and want to be like Americans in everything. It's a bit harsh for me to say like this, but I think you understand what I'm trying to say here. The main point that I'm trying to say is the danger of imposing a foreign faith. How can Christianity stop being a foreign faith? I would say that Christianity can stop being a foreign faith when we, the indigenous Christians, start to take responsibility to indigenize the faith, to think about our faith seriously in your context. Let's say, I've always shared to you my context. My context is develop issues of development like deforestation or corruption in the government. In that context, how do we imagine mission? How do we imagine Christian faith? Christian faith that says, that follows Jesus, who says, I have come to set the captives free. I have come to proclaim good news to the poor. When we follow such a Jesus, such a Lord who proclaims justice and compassion, how can we as Christians who follow such a Jesus act according to a Christian faith? When we start thinking seriously about these questions for our context, then Christianity can stop being a foreign faith. Christianity can take on the responsibility of engaging with the issues that we have in our daily lives. I want to share with you the picture of the incarnation, the big theological word incarnation. Incarnation is the idea that Jesus took on human flesh and human body, adopted human culture. And even though he was God, he was above human cultures, human time and history. He was humble enough to become adopted into a human family, a human culture, learn the language of human beings, learn to talk like human beings, eat like human beings, incarnated in body, in the flesh of human beings, to suffer, experience the suffering, the struggles of human beings. Jesus Christ was incarnated into the historical, the cultural context of first century Judea. That is an important lesson for us. In the same way, the Christian message must also be incarnated in our context, in your and in my context. The Christian message must be incarnated in the context of the hills, the image that you see in this picture here, the slideshow here. Christian message must be incarnated in the context of the culture that you see articulated here in this slideshow. In your context, in the place that you're living, not just in terms of culture, but in terms of socioeconomic issues that we have shared, the political issues that you may live in. Incarnation. And secondly, the notion of reconciliation. The goal of mission is reconciliation, to reconcile God's creation with God and with one another. What I see here in this story, that the cautionary tale that I just told you about the foreign faith, this is not a story of reconciliation. This was a story of breaking. This was a story of breaking human beings from their natural habitat, breaking human beings from their culture, from their traditions, from the land, from forest, from the neighbors, and breaking them away from the good parts of their culture. I think instead of that, we need to imagine our mission, as reconciling the the hurts and the anxieties of this world. Uh, Not just human beings, mind you, but also in God's creation. So, incarnation and reconciliation. I invite you to think about that. Incarnation and reconciliation. Incarnation, Jesus was incarnated in this world, in the particular culture and in language. Yes, he transcended as well as he incarnated, but first it was incarnated. And with that, I invite you to think intentionally in your own cultures, in your context, in your own context. How can the message of Jesus can also be incarnated in your own context? And reconciliation. The goal of mission is reconciliation, is to reconcile all of creation according to God, back to God. So let's go back finally to the questions that we began with, and I'm not going to take very long on this, but the critical questions for you to think about: whose mission is this? It's God's mission. It's not empire. It's not the church. It's not denomination. It's God's mission. What are the goals of this mission? The goal of mission is reconciliation, to gather people to God, to the healing power of God. What are the methods of mission? The methods of mission is to be attentive to what God is doing in this world, to not assume that we have all the answers, but to pay attention to what God is doing in this world. So I think that's it for my lecture. I thank you very much for all your attention, for listening so closely to what I've been sharing. I would love to hear from you. I would love to engage with your thoughts, and even if you may not have, even if there may be confusion, or might be some thing that you might disagree or you might not like, or you feel I should have engaged more. My hope is that at least this have given you something to think about, something important to think about, which is the theology of mission. And yes, I have also touched on a few controversial and very contentious, sensitive issues, but these are things that must be engaged. And let's put it like this: I'm happy to be the one to engage it and to start the conversation. So I hope that has been helpful for you, and I look forward to hearing and engaging with you in the comments later. God bless all of you. Let me pray, and I will. I'm done. I'm done for the lectures. Okay, so let me pray and bless you all in your church and in your ministry. Let's pray. Our Father in heaven, we thank you so much for you are the God who started mission. You are the God who came to us, who started by blessing us, by creating us, by blessing us. We thank you, Lord, that even though I'm from a different part of the world, and even those who are listening are from a different part of the world, we are united in Christ, and we are one in Christ. And I may never meet them or may never understand their context, but at the same time, we rejoice in the fact that we are working together in your mission and in your calling. So we give you thanks for that. We thank you for the opportunity to reflect together throughout these past few lectures, and we pray that the things that we have shared will spur us to be to be intentional in our ministry, and to take seriously the call to mission, the reason for which you have sent us out to the world, to reconcile this creation back to you. We thank you for your blessing upon us, and we pray, Lord, that you would bless our brothers and sisters and their ministry, be with them, guide them, and empower them so that they will continue to serve you with zeal and with passion, knowing that we are doing what you have started, and we can lean on you to finish what you have started. We thank you for hearing our prayers. We pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. Amen. Thank you so much. God bless all of you.